For part three in our discussion about data and what statistics is all about, we're going to talk about some of the basics of study or research design. In statistics, you have these two main kinds of studies that you often encounter: observational studies and experimental studies. So we're going to talk a little bit about those two major types of research studies. This really can be viewed in the context of this general process of investigation. These four steps that we talked about earlier: identifying a question or problem, collecting relevant data on the topic, analyzing the data, and making a conclusion. Well, research or study design really helps us improve the collection of relevant data. It makes collecting data transparent, and it also helps us to understand what kinds of inferences or what kind of conclusions we can make based on the data at hand. The major types of statistical studies are observational and experimental. And then among observational studies, we like to distinguish between cross-sectional studies and longitudinal or panel studies. Observational studies, they entail some kind of observation and measurement, but there's no direct intervention. There's no attempt to alter what's going on in terms of social dynamics or in terms of the world around us. Experimental studies, the goal is to apply some kind of intervention. So you might give people a pill versus people not receiving a pill. You might try to alter the conditions in which they live or how they live their lives. The point is that experimental studies, you have some kind of intervention. In observational studies, you don't have an intervention. Let's talk a little bit about observational studies. With observational studies, we typically cannot prove cause and effect. The reason is that we're just observing, we're just measuring what's going on, and there's no kind of intervention. A survey is a typical kind of observational study. You take a sample from a population and you ask them questions. You say, do you approve or disapprove of marijuana use? How old are you? What's your religious identification? Surveys are very commonly used. In a cross-sectional observational study, data are collected at one point in time on a set of individuals. So if you just collect data in 1955, that is a cross-sectional study. A longitudinal study, also known as a panel study, is an observational study in which data are collected over time on the same individuals. So if you ask people a question in 1950, and then you ask the same group of people a question in 1955, 1960, that is a panel study because you're collecting data over time on the same individuals. Panel studies are much more expensive than cross-sectional studies, but they can be useful for analyzing trends and patterns in data. Let's look at an example of an observational study. Let's think about the obesity epidemic. Some researchers at Harvard, they tracked the same people over time from 1971 to 2003. And then they used the survey data to examine the spread of obesity through people's social networks. The authors concluded, quote, "Our study suggests that obesity may spread in social networks in a quantifiable and discernible pattern," end quote. What they found was that if you're obese, then over time your friends tend to be obese. This is a longitudinal or panel observational study. It's observational because they're not making any change in the world. They're not trying to alter people's behaviors. They're just trying to observe and measure what's going on around them. One point about observational studies is that you need to be careful with interpreting the results. In an observational study, there can always be confounding or lurking variables affecting the results. What this means practically is that observational studies can rarely show causation. At the very least, it's very, very difficult, and it requires very strong assumptions about the world around us if you want to take an observational study and say something about cause and effect. Sometimes it's very tempting to say something about cause and effect. So in the observational study on obesity, it's very tempting to say that if you get fat, then you're causing your friends to get fat. But it's very possible that maybe a fast food restaurant opened down the street, and it just happened that you started eating at the fast food restaurant more, and then your friend did. And so what appeared to be a cause and effect pattern was really caused by the fact that a fast food restaurant opened down the street. That's why we like to say cause and effect relationships when we have an experiment. It's much easier to use an experiment than an observational study to say cause and effect. So let's consider a confounding variable in general. A confounding variable is a variable not included in the study design that has an effect on the variables studied. So in the case of social networks and obesity, a confounding variable could be the fast food restaurant that opened down the street. To take another example, if you study sunscreen and cancer, you might say that sunscreen is causing cancer if you just look at people who use sunscreen and cancer. So you might gather a sample of data, you might observe what's going on over time, and you might say, wow, people who are using sunscreen are more likely to have skin cancer. However, the confounding or lurking variable very well could be that you're emitting the level of sun exposure. So people who use the sun, who go out on the beach more often, tend to use sunscreen more often, but still that sun exposure, those people tend to have higher levels of cancer, skin cancer, than those people who stay indoors all the time. So there's this confounding variable of sun exposure that you're not adjusting for in your observational study. That's why we like to use experimental studies to say something about cause and effect. Experimental studies entail the application of some intervention or treatment. You're trying to change something about the world around you so that you can say something about that intervention having an effect, a cause and effect. Experimental studies, they're very widely used in psychology and medicine. The idea behind an experimental study is that individuals or subjects, they are randomly assigned to treatment and control groups. The treatment group receives the intervention and the control group does not. Trying to remove known effective confounders by controlling the environmental conditions in this way is another part of an experimental study. So if you know that there's some part of the environment that might bias or alter the causal effect, you do try to control that as well. That's why experimental studies, they're often called randomized, because you're randomizing the treatment and control assignments, but you're also trying to control the environment. So they're often called randomized controlled trials, or RCTs for short. So here's another example involving neighborhoods and obesity. So women and children living in poor neighborhoods were randomly assigned to have an opportunity to live in wealthier neighborhoods. So the experimenters were trying to alter the behavior of people in the world. So there's this intervention. They're saying, okay, you might live in a poor neighborhood, but we're going to give you the opportunity to live in a wealthier neighborhood. And by applying this intervention, they examined obesity levels. As a result, they conclude the opportunity to move from a neighborhood with a high level of poverty to one with a lower level of poverty was associated with modest but potentially important reductions in the prevalence of extreme obesity and diabetes. So they could make this claim about cause and effect, the cause being living in a poor neighborhood and the effect being obesity and diabetes levels. They could make this claim because they were applying some kind of intervention to the world. So it might seem like experiments are great, because why don't people always conduct experiments and not do observational studies at all? Well, there are some major disadvantages with experiments. First of all, they can be unethical, especially if you conduct them on vulnerable populations or if the treatment is known to be harmful. So suppose that you took a sample of people living in wealthy neighborhoods and said, okay, the treatment is going to be moving you to a poor neighborhood. Well, is that ethical? Because living in a poor neighborhood can be very harmful to people's mental well-being, as many sociologists have documented. It can also be difficult to monitor subjects to ensure that they're doing what they're told. So in an experimental study, you want to make sure that there's no other confounding variable, and you also want to make sure that they are, they're actually responding to the treatment in the way that you expect them to. For example, suppose you tell people, okay, you have to take this pill every day, and that's the treatment. Well, what happens if they don't take the pill every day? Well, then your estimate of the causal effect might be biased or might be distorted. Another disadvantage is that often experiments, they're done on animals, but they don't necessarily generalize to humans. So you'll see a lot of studies, they'll make some claim about human behavior, but in fact they use experiments based on animals. This is particularly true in some fields of psychology. A final disadvantage with experiments is that they can take years and decades to complete, especially if the treatment or the intervention is a treatment that takes over time. For example, in the case of the intervention being living in a poor neighborhood, where we're giving people the opportunity to move to a richer neighborhood, that intervention, that takes years, maybe decades to really complete. So it can be, the end result is experiments can be very expensive to conduct. Things to know for our discussion about study or research design. First, observational studies, they entail observation and measurement, but no intervention. You're not trying to change the world around you. Experimental studies, they entail the application of some intervention. So you're trying to change the world around you in some way. For example, you might be trying to alter the behavior of some set of subjects so that you can say something about cause and effect. Observational studies can be either cross-sectional, involving a snapshot in time, or longitudinal, in which case you're analyzing the same, or tracking the same people over time. So you might, for a longitudinal study, you might measure people's behavior in 1950, 1955, and 1960. And by doing so, you can obtain a richer description of the data. Finally, it can be difficult to say anything about causation in observational studies because of the presence of lurking or confounding variables. That concludes our discussion this week of study or research design.